What's going on, everybody? Zack Heydorn here with Brass Ring Media. Welcome into Spotlight. And I am with a very, very special guest today. So excited to chat. Jennifer McGee, author of Fight Forever, the Ballad of Kevin and Sami. Jennifer, how's it going? Congratulations on the book.
Thank you so much. It is great to be here. Thank you for having me on the show.
So what is it? I know you haven't held the book yet because you're in Japan, but how does it feel to have this out in the wild? I mean, it's a labor of love and it's out there,
isn't it? Yeah. I mean, I've been researching it kind of casually for about a decade now. And it's only a couple of years ago that Jonathan Snowden got in touch with me and said, would you be willing to make that into a book? So it's been a long, long, long process, but then it kind of went fairly quickly at the end because I had done so much research beforehand without even really meaning to, just because I wanted to know more. So
how did this? So take me way back to the beginning. So 10 years ago, what was the precipice of you starting to research this particular rivalry? Was it one thing that you saw, or what made you start pulling at the thread that was Sami and Kevin?
Well, most people assume that I have been along for the whole ride, starting from their days in Quebec as Kevin Steen and El Generico, but I have not.
Okay.
I actually I had been a casual kind of wrestling fan for a while, and then I picked up the network in about 2014. And because NXT was on the network, I started watching NXT and fell in love with Sami.
Yeah.
Very, very quickly, because he was in the middle of his road to redemption story on his way to winning the title. And at the time, I didn't even know who El Generico was. I saw people talking about him here and there, and I was like, I wonder who that is. No idea. I think by the time Kevin showed up, I knew who El Generico was, but I didn't for a long time. And it was when Kevin debuted and came out and celebrated with Sami, and then immediately 6 minutes and 42 seconds later, attacked him, threw him down, challenged him for the title. And I could immediately tell that there was years and years and years of history behind them. And I said, that's it. That's my thing. I'm going to watch every match and every promo these two guys were ever in.
Wow.
And at the time, I was like, it's going to be a big challenge, but it can't be more than 10 or 15 matches, right? Maybe I can hunt down all 10 matches they were in before this one. And then I went and looked on Cage Match and went, oh no, this is a much bigger project than I thought it was. But it was too late. I had sworn an oath, and I had to follow through on it.
So did you make it through all of them?
There are a bunch that never got recorded.
Sure. Okay.
For a variety of reasons. Just about every match I think that exists still on video, I think I have seen now, pretty much.
Very good. Very cool.
There's they're in a random Royal Rumble in Italy, and I've seen it's a Battle Royal in Italy in 2005, including Becky Lynch, Rebecca Quinn at the time. And I've seen little bits of that one even, which is pretty amazing. I think I just saw the ending. But I think I've seen most of the ones that you can see that have both of them in it. There are still a lot of matches with just one or the other, because that's nearly infinite.
Yeah.
I could never do that.
What a journey. So how did you hook up with Hybrid Shoot then and Jonathan to get the project going? Because the reason I asked that is having written a book too, the process of that is just it's grueling, it's draining, but it's also so rewarding. And I feel like everybody has their special story of how different things came to be in order to make it happen. So how did you connect with Jonathan to get the project off the ground and turn it from a just fun research thing that you were doing to, a book that now is in people's hands?
Yeah, well, apparently it came about mostly because of Jonathan Snowden's wife, Christina, who follows me on Twitter, and apparently suggested to Jonathan that he get in touch with me and pitch a book and say, you've written a bunch of stuff already. Why don't you kind of make it into more of an official piece of book, an official book, a piece of book, you know what I mean? And at the time, I have to confess, I was like, oh, that's a great idea. Maybe I'll do that sometime. And I did not follow up on it very quickly because I just couldn't really wrap my head around the idea of actually writing a book. And so some time went by, and it was when Kevin and Sami started the Bloodline story. When Sami started getting involved in the Bloodline and Kevin was saying, they're not your friends, you shouldn't be in the Bloodline, I looked at that and I said, oh, that's leading to them winning the tag titles together, almost certainly. And then I was like, oh, I have to actually start writing this book. And by then I was way behind, so I didn't finish it until well after they won the tag team titles. But that was what finally got me to realize, no, you need to actually write this. It isn't going to write itself. You have to start actually focusing on writing it. I just couldn't get my head around the idea of writing a book. It seemed bizarre to me almost.
And so how did that process go for you once you started writing? Did you just organize up and figure out like, okay, this is the path I want to take, or just take me through the process?
I'm a very, very linear writer.
Okay.
I tend to start at the beginning and go to the end. And so in some ways that makes it very simple. In other ways, part of the reason I got jammed up was that I would be like, oh, now I have to go research this.
Right.
And I didn't really have the ability to skip to another part. So I struggled with that a little bit. I tend to be very linear in how I approach. And so now and then I would get stalled out and do too much research.
What was the most surprising thing to you about writing the book? We're going to get into Sami and Kevin specifically here, but in terms of writing the book itself, like what was the most surprising thing about it for you?
Like, what's the most surprising thing I found, or the most surprising part of writing a book?
Yeah, the part about what's the most surprising part of actually writing a book? Yeah.
I don't know. It was very surprising to discover that I could do it.
Yeah.
I don't know. I've written a lot.
Sure.
I wrote a PhD thesis. So
okay. So
and yet a book seems somehow different. It was just kind of shocking to discover that you could bring it together. I ended up reading a lot of books about biography.
Really?
Yeah, and just how to approach writing something like this, because as you know, writing wrestling biographies is really weird and different.
Yeah.
In part just because so many characters cross paths and then disappear, and sometimes come back and sometimes don't. When I was reading your book, actually, I appreciated the sort of, you would stop and say, here are the major characters in this chapter. Basically, here are the rivals we're going to be talking about.
Sure. Yep.
And I was like, oh, that's a really good way to do it. Because so Seth Rollins comes and goes through decades, and I'd have to keep stopping and going, this is Tyler Black. You've seen him before, like a year ago. You're going to see him again in the future. And that was a real challenge. That was a very different way of writing, because characters just kept coming and going. And I'd have to stop and say, okay, this is Seth Rollins. He's now a heel. Last time you saw him, he was a babyface. But now, for reasons complex and I can't go into here, he's now a heel, sort of things. This character wandered off and did all sorts of stuff, and now he's back. Was really kind of surprisingly hard to deal with.
And I feel like too, with like that era of star, like Seth and Sami and Kevin, and like I would lump like Claudio into that, like
Bryan
Bryan
Danielson.
Danielson into that. Like they're like of the same era, right? And so they cross paths so often, and
So often.
as different names and as different roles and in different
Right.
companies. Like, yeah, that is definitely man, that is an interesting nugget of insight into writing. Because yeah, it's when I was doing mine, it was easier because it was just, it was one guy, Steve Austin, like, and then like, okay, let's talk about his career. But you're kind of you're floating in and out of all these different promotions
Yeah.
because
Is this
you
Bryan Danielson or Daniel Bryan?
Daniel
Is
Bryan,
this
yeah, right, exactly,
Tyler
exactly.
Black, or is it Seth Rollins? Yeah. Yeah, they have to
Interesting.
stop changing names so much.
Yeah, I know.
Please stop. Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about Sami and Kevin. Like what is it about the two of them and their rivalry that didn't even necessarily spark your interest to write the book, but just what connected you to, I guess let's start with Sami, because that's the catalyst for all this. What attracted you to him as a wrestler and as somebody to follow, where you look at it and went, whoa, I'm in on this guy? Like what was it about? What was it about him? And then is there anything that you can kind of clue in the audience on that your research showed that kind of laid a foundation for him to become what he is?
Yeah. I think a big part, it's connected to the book and the history. Big part of the reason he was so appealing to me in NXT is that a lot of, when you go back and watch NXT from like 2014 now, it's like you can see a lot of characters who are just kind of getting the hang of things. Like it's amazing to watch 2014 Sasha Banks because
Yeah.
it feels kind of like a woman doing an okay cosplay of Sasha Banks. She doesn't quite know who Sasha Banks is yet. She's getting there.
Mm-hmm.
But Sami is fascinating because the second he shows up, you know that he's got a huge history behind him. Like his first gear, he has flags from all the countries that he's wrestled in. When he first shows up and confronts Cesaro, he speaks French
Mm-hmm.
and Arabic and English to him. And so you just have this very clear feeling that this is a guy who has existed before this, which is really fascinating because technically he hadn't, right? There was
Right.
no Sami Zayn before that,
Right.
but you
Right.
could really feel the weight of the years in his character in a way that I think other NXT people at that time kind of struggled to have because
Mm-hmm.
they were actually mostly just getting started. And so that really caught me about Sami right away, was he knew who he was and where
Mm-hmm.
he'd been in a way that a lot of other wrestlers didn't at the time in NXT.
Yeah, that is fascinating. Yeah, there is like with him and Kevin, but especially Sami, like, and I think you can count on like maybe like one hand the number of talents that have that just unabashed authenticity, where what you see is what you get, and it's so easy to connect with them because they're so real. Like they put it on the line. Like I think Bryan Danielson is a lot like that too, in that, he's just an easy guy to connect with for whatever reason. His heart's out there, and Sami, I think, is the same way. I always, talk about it on shows and whatnot that I do. It's like Sami, man, you just feel for him no matter what it is that he's doing, whether he's in a match with Johnny Knoxville at WrestleMania 38, which is kind of this like bells and whistles crazy match. Yeah. You feel that with him, and even when he's working heel, you can feel that. And then, man, when he works babyface, though, that's when
It's something else.
It's something else, because that's when you really feel that. So same question about Kevin Owens, because I think he's got a different type of authentic, he's a different type of character. He's a different type of guy. But what, to you, based on what you've watched and what you've seen, like what stands out about him, and what makes him, pop off the screen?
It's interesting because, not surprisingly, I hated Kevin at first.
Well, of course.
Kind of pretty sincerely, you know. I legitimately was kind of like, clearly this is a pretty bad person. Yes. And just because he's so believably bad, and he has the ability to connect with audiences in a heelish way that almost perfectly mirrors Sami's connection in a face way, which makes sense because they worked together so much that I think they became this sort of really well-oiled machine together, where he knew exactly how to make Sami the best kind of babyface, and Sami knew exactly how to make him the best kind of heel.
Yeah.
And it wasn't actually until I saw him wrestle live that he really clicked with me. I went and saw him wrestle live against Neville, actually, at the time, Pac, in the main event in Fort Pierce, Florida.
Okay.
Of all places. And I don't know, just watching him wrestle, you could just, you can feel it.
Was that on an NXT loop?
It
or
was.
It was
right after he won the NXT title.
Okay.
Right after he beat Sami for it. And so I was furious, And we went down to Fort Pierce and saw him wrestle. And he just talked trash with the audience the whole match. There was somebody yelling at him because he wasn't at the meet and greet. And Kevin was like, I can't understand a word you're saying, but sorry, I guess. And I could feel his connection with the audience. I think heels are sometimes much easier to feel that in live performances.
Yeah.
Like, I got that with The Miz, too. When I saw The Miz live, I realized how tightly connected he was with the audience, how much he was responding to the audience in a way that doesn't come across as well on TV. And I think Kevin comes across really well on TV, too, obviously. But in person, there's something much more tangible with him. Just an energy between him and the audience that I think is really, really intense and really good.
So we talked about like Sami and Kevin, and of course this book, Fight Forever, The Ballad of Kevin and Sami, is about both of them and their history. Why, based on the research that you did and the studying that you did of all the matches, like, why do those two guys have such chemistry together in your eyes?
My theory, and I don't know, and I wish I would love to ask them sometime. My theory has always been that they have a particularly great partnership because Kevin is the long-term thinker of the two, that he's the person who keeps like a character arc in his mind, who thinks about where our characters have come from and where they're going. And that's his strength. And Sami's strength is building the actual match to showcase where their character arc is right now. And so they've got the long-term vision and the bell-to-bell ring general strategy in one sort of pairing. And I think that makes them kind of unstoppable because they trust each other's opinions so much, and tend to rely on each other when they... All of these stories about them arguing are never of them arguing with the other people in the match. They're always arguing with each other. Like the American Wolves, Eddie Edwards remembers just sitting and listening to Sami and Kevin argue for hours up until the moment the bell was about to ring. And he and Davey Richards just sat there and listened to them argue. They weren't part of the argument at all, apparently. In part because Kevin and Sami really trust each other and their opinions, I think, more than anybody else. So they have a tendency, I think, to get into arguments with each other. And sometimes not include other people who are in the match. But I think that leads to them really having a good chemistry in how to construct a match.
And then that's such an insightful answer. How great is that? The the relationship and history with them, we know, and you kind of alluded to it there, but in the ring, they just, it's like they don't have bad matches. Like they, throughout, whether it's Generico against Steen or Owens against Zayn or them as a tag team, they just don't have bad matches. And I think a lot of it is what you mentioned just now. But is there anything else that you can shed light on as to like why it is they're so crisp and on point, like in the ring, not like necessarily big picture topics, but actually just like nuts and bolts in the ring? They're so smooth together. And I find it fascinating because you'd think everybody has a bad night at the office, right? I'm going to do like bad interview or write a bad story, whatever. Like it happens. Not with those two though. Not with those two guys.
That's one of the things that happened was when I started doing research, I was thinking to myself, okay, I'm going to go back and find the earliest match I can. And eventually there'll be some match where they're kind of clumsy in the ring together. I want to see them figuring out how to wrestle each other. And it doesn't exist.
Yeah, right.
I went back to I found eventually, thanks to Kevin, their very first match. And it's great right away. They
Wow.
they really click immediately. The first time they're in the ring together, they're clearly just really good together. Like physically, they're very, very good at responding to each other. They're really good at knowing what needs to be done to make the match move and make the other person look great. And they just clicked naturally right away.
Is there anything that that you kind of picked up along the way that surprised you about them? As far as like just performers or rivals or friends, like what kind of like piqued your interest in terms of like, I did not know that, or I didn't know that. Like what's something that surprised you in terms of your research for the project?
The thing that surprised me the most happened at the very end, which is that Jonathan Snowden, our publisher, got finally an interview between me and Kevin and Sami. And in the middle of the interview, they started arguing about whether or not Generico should come back.
Wow.
And to my utter shock, Kevin wants him to come back for at least one appearance. And that surprised me because Kevin has always been, for years, if you ask Kevin what's up with El Generico, he will tell you that he is dead.
Yeah.
In various lurid ways. And so I had always just kind of assumed that he was fine with El Generico being done.
Mm-hmm.
And no, in this conversation, it was very clear that he really wants to wrestle El Generico at least one more time. I absolutely did not expect that. I was really startled by that.
That is so cool. Yeah, I mean,
Sami is a lot more ambivalent about it.
In that he just wants it to. It's been there, done that type thing.
He feels like El Generico has entered the realm of sort of a folk hero, and that it wouldn't be the same.
Yeah. What do you think?
He compared it to the Beatles. He said if the Beatles, you can't have a Beatles reunion now, it wouldn't be the same thing. Maybe it's because I came to Sami first and learned about El Generico later, but I actually kind of agree with Sami.
I do too.
I've always been okay with El Generico going off into the sunset and being done. I'm not saying I wouldn't pop like crazy if he did show up. Yeah. I would, absolutely. But I'm very content with El Generico's story being done.
I am too. And sometimes I think, nostalgia is good and it's always fun, but especially in pro wrestling, because it's so rare in pro wrestling to just let something lie, you know, like
Mhm.
there's always, you just, I can't think of very many things that just get to just be in,
Finish.
yeah, in
Yes.
the wrestling industry. And, that one would be a cool one to just let it be, like let it be, let it go, and do its thing. And I'm with you on that. Guys, the book is called Fight Forever. It's the Ballad of Kevin and Sami by Jennifer McGee. It is available now. Can you tell people how they can find it, how they can get their copies, how they can pre-order, or where we're at with how people can get this?
Right now, the pre-order is done,
Okay.
and those are all shipped out now. They're getting it set up to go out on Amazon and other booksellers, and probably it will be available in early May.
Very
So
good.
pretty soon now, pretty soon.
Excellent. So I will make sure to keep everybody up to date on when that on sale goes. We'll update the show notes here once that happens. But Jennifer, thank you so much for the time, guys. The book is great. Once again, it's Fight Forever: The Ballad of Kevin and Sami from Hybrid Shoot. Jennifer McGee. Jennifer, thank you so much for your time and your insight, and for writing this wonderful book. Maybe, you know, as the year goes on, and we can have you back on
I'd
and
love
do
that.
some more Kevin and Sami analysis as
Well, I wanted at some point we have to sit down and talk about Steve Austin's last match with Kevin,
yes. Oh my
since
God,
our
we
books
do.
intersect there.
They
So
do. They do. Yes. Oh my gosh. Okay. I'm going to hold you to that.
okay,
That
absolutely.
that'd be really fun. Oh my gosh. Yes. That would be a blast. We'll definitely do that. But in the meantime, congratulations. It's such an accomplishment.
Feels
And
good.
everybody go pick it up once it drops in May. Jennifer McGee. Jennifer, thank you.
Thank you very much.